Somewhere right now, behind a door you will never be welcomed through, a small circle of researchers is sitting on something they are genuinely too afraid to say aloud. In 2024, they fed the Dead Sea Scrolls into an artificial intelligence and let it run for 96 hours straight. When it was done, no one cheered. The room fell silent. They began meeting behind closed doors, and they have not stopped since. Because the machine did not simply read the oldest version of the Bible in existence, it read what had been hidden inside it, things no human eye had ever managed to catch. And once you grasp what it pulled out of those pages, you will understand exactly why these people went quiet and stopped returning calls from journalists. The rock that didn't echo. It all began with a missing goat, spring of 1947. A Bedouin shepherd by the name of Mohammed Ed Dib was picking his way through the cliffs rising above the Dead Sea, hunting for an animal that had drifted away from his flock. Trying to drive it out of a cave, he hurled a stone into the dark, but it did not echo the way a rock is supposed to echo inside an empty cave. It struck something hollow and cracked against it, pottery, so he pulled himself inside, and there in the darkness, he found 7 clay jars, each one sealed with wax. Pause for a moment and put yourself inside that cave. A shepherd alone. Not the faintest idea that he is standing on the most consequential ground in modern archaeology, looking at 7 sealed containers that had not been disturbed since before the age of Christ. He was there looking for a goat. He had no idea what he had stumbled onto. He could not possibly have known. What was waiting inside those jars turned out to be the single most important archaeological find of the entire 20th century. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Roughly 25,000 fragments of leather, parchment, and papyrus. The oldest known surviving copies of the Hebrew Bible. Texts that reached back more than 1,000 years further than the scriptures underpinning every modern Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition. Words that no living person had set eyes on in 2,000 years. Think carefully about what that shepherd actually cracked open. It was not just a cave. It was a window into what the Bible looked like before 2,000 years of translation, editing, and revision had turned it into the book the entire world recognizes today. And here is the part that almost nobody likes to sit with. For 75 years after that goat wandered off, we could barely make sense of what he had found. The fragments are small, the ink has faded to nearly nothing. The scholarship is scattered across dozens of institutions, dozens of languages, and dozens of competing agendas that do not always line up. Try to picture it honestly. A researcher in one country spends 10 years on a single column of text, arguing in academic journals over whether some faded mark is actually a letter or just damage to the leather. Meanwhile, the fragment that would complete that very sentence is sitting in a sealed archive on another continent, photographed once, filed under a different catalog number, never linked to the work being done 1,000 miles away. The pieces were never in the same room. They were never even part of the same conversation. And the problem runs deeper than just geography. Some of those fragments are no bigger than your thumbnail. The ink on them is almost the same color as the leather beneath it. A single scrap might carry 3 letters, and those 3 letters might belong to a word that completely reshapes the meaning of an entire verse. If only you could work out which word, which verse, and which of the thousands of other scraps it once lay beside. 3 letters at a time. For 75 years, that was the wall the whole field had been pressed up against for 3/4 of a century. The evidence had survived, the fragments had survived, but no human mind could hold all of it at once, cross-reference everything simultaneously, or compare every faded mark against every other faded mark across the full collection. The limit was never the scrolls themselves, the limit was us, until 2024. A research team spread across 3 universities fed the entire archive into a deep learning model trained specifically on ancient handwriting in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Every fragment, every photograph, every infrared and multispectral scan gathered over decades, all of it loaded into a single system and unleashed. 96 hours later, the machine delivered its findings. And that is the moment the scholars went quiet. Because what it uncovered does not start in the comfortable surroundings of a university library. It starts in one of the most terrifying locations in the Judean desert, the Cave of Horror. That name was not chosen casually. In 2021, Israeli archaeologists launched an expedition into one of the most dangerous and hard-to-reach caves in the Judean desert, Cave 8, a site partially explored years before but never properly excavated. It earned that grim name from what earlier expeditions had discovered waiting inside, roughly 40 skeletons, men, women, children. These were Jewish refugees who had taken shelter in that cave during the Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome, sometime around 132 to 136 CE. The Romans traced them there, established camp on the cliffs overhead, and simply waited. No water inside the cave, no food, no escape. The refugees perished right where they had taken cover, caught between Roman soldiers above and a 250-foot drop below, choosing death over surrender. Their bones lay in that cave for nearly 1,900 years. Let that image settle. Families pressed together in the darkness, listening to soldiers moving across the rock above them, knowing no rescue was coming, knowing the water had run out, knowing exactly how it would end. And in those final days, with all of that closing in around them, some of them were still transcribing scripture, still safeguarding the words. That detail is going to carry more weight than you can appreciate right now. The 2021 expedition recovered around 80 new scroll fragments, tiny slivers of parchment, some no bigger than a fingernail, preserved by nothing except the cave's extreme dryness and steady temperature. Most were too deteriorated for conventional reading. Some displayed clear text, some showed only faint traces. Some looked completely blank until placed beneath advanced imaging equipment. But the researchers understood what they were holding. The fragments belonged to the Scroll of the 12, also known as the Minor Prophets Scroll, containing material from the books of Nahum, Zechariah, and other prophetic writings. And here is the strange part. They were composed in Greek, not Hebrew, not Aramaic. Greek. The Dead Sea Scrolls are overwhelmingly written in Hebrew and Aramaic. Greek fragments are uncommon, and when they do appear, they point to a Jewish community that had taken on the language of the wider Mediterranean world, a community reading and preserving its scripture in translation. Remember where this particular Greek text was found, not in a library, not in a temple, in the cave of horror beside the bones of people who died clutching it. So who were these people, concealing Greek scripture in a Hebrew-speaking land, copying sacred text while an empire tracked them through the desert? For decades, the honest answer was that no one could say with confidence. The fragments were too far gone. Scholars could identify a handful of letters, suggest tentative reconstructions, and go no further. Certainty remained out of reach. They needed something far more powerful than human eyes and human endurance. They needed a machine. What the machine saw. The analysis began with technology that would have seemed like science fiction just one generation earlier. The fragments were scanned in visible light across multiple wavelengths, then photographed under infrared, which draws out ink that has faded to complete invisibility under ordinary conditions. Then examined under ultraviolet, which causes certain organic compounds to glow and reveals writing that the naked eye cannot detect at all. A fragment that appeared completely empty, a scrap a scholar might have dismissed as worthless, could blaze under infrared and expose a full line of writing that had been invisible for 2,000 years. Ink fades, but it does not always disappear. It sinks down into the parchment. It transforms. It becomes impossible for human eyes to detect, yet still leaves behind a trace that the right wavelength of light can draw back to the surface. The imaging process added nothing to the scrolls. It uncovered what was already present: waiting. And I want you to truly sit with that, because it is almost too much to bear when you really consider it. The words were never gone. They had been resting there on the parchment the whole time, for 2,000 years, while generation after generation of scholars stared directly at them and saw nothing but blank, ruined leather. We were not missing the text because the text had been lost. We were missing it because our eyes were simply never designed to catch it. The machine had only opened a door that had existed there all along. Those images were then fed into deep learning models trained on ancient manuscript handwriting. Systems that had already studied thousands of examples of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek scripts from the Second Temple period. Letter shapes, scribal tendencies, the tiny patterns a human reader would walk straight past. But the machine did not merely read the scrolls, it reconstructed them. It located faint letter traces that human analysts had completely missed. It matched fragments that had been separated for decades, pieces that physically came from the same document, yet had been filed away in different collections, examined by different scholars, and never once identified as parts of a single original text. It detected palimpsests, spots where writing had been scraped off and written over, with the earlier version still ghosting beneath. Consider what that one capability alone actually means. 2 scraps of parchment torn from the same line, separated at some point across 2,000 years, ending up in different archives, different countries, different academic careers. No human ever connects them because no human can hold an entire collection in view at once. Then the machine surveys everything in a single pass and quietly brings the 2 halves back together, like a sentence finishing itself after 20 centuries of silence. It also read handwriting with a precision no human analyst could come close to matching. It measured the spacing between letters down to fractions of a millimeter. It detected the pressure behind every stroke. It identified variations in how individual letters were formed, variations pointing to different scribes, different time periods, and as it turned out, something nobody on the team had been prepared for: the handwriting of fear. What the machine flagged was a section from the Book of Nahum, and the handwriting there was not simply different. It was wrong, jagged, rushed, uneven. The spacing between letters lurched without any predictable pattern. The pressure behind each stroke shifted from word to word. The lines wandered away from horizontal. Every characteristic pointed to a scribe writing quickly under enormous stress, with none of the steady control that defined the rest of that same scroll. The analysts pulled it up and looked closely. What they were seeing was not merely a different hand, it was fear made visible in parchment. Understand what the machine was actually measuring here. It measured letter spacing down to fractions of a millimeter, and within those measurements, it found something no chemical analysis and no carbon dating could ever reveal. It found a state of mind, the trembling in the strokes, the brief hesitations where the pen had stopped completely in the middle of a word, the broken, shaking rhythm of a hand, a lean that was cold or exhausted or terrified. 2,000 years collapsed into the gap between 2 letters. And what came through that gap was not data. It was a feeling. And that is the moment the Cave of Horror shifted from a label on a map to an actual scene. What made it cut even deeper was the contrast. Other sections of that same scroll were calm, controlled, and steady, the work of a trained hand with plenty of time. So this was not a clumsy scribe or some inexperienced copyist. This was a skilled individual whose hand had simply ceased to be steady. Something had shifted between one passage and the next. Something had gone wrong inside that room. Consider who was actually present in that cave. These were not scrolls produced in some peaceful scriptorium by professional scribes working at their own pace. They were copied by people who were fleeing, people in hiding, people who understood that Roman soldiers were tracking them across the desert, that their entire community was being torn apart, that everything they held sacred was on the verge of being wiped away. And they copied scripture, regardless, by the light of a lamp, inside a cave with trembling hands, while the empire that intended to kill them set up camp on the cliffs right above their heads. Those scrolls were never simply religious objects. They were acts of defiance, messages left behind by people who refused to let their faith vanish quietly alongside them. And a machine 17 centuries later picked up that defiance in the pressure behind every letter, the physical evidence of courage stamped directly into the parchment. Imagine being one of those researchers. You feed dry data into a model expecting letter shapes and rough date estimates. And what comes back is the hand of a terrified human being writing in darkness during the final days of their life. That is not the sort of thing you put out in a press release the very next morning. That is the sort of thing you sit with in a quiet room alongside the handful of other people on Earth who truly grasp what they are looking at. But the fear captured in one scroll was not what shook the researchers most. The real shock arrived when the machine stopped studying individual fragments and turned its focus to all 25,000 of them together. Not one library, a rescue operation. You probably know the standard version of the story. A Jewish sect, typically identified as the Essenes, lived at Qumran near the caves. They copied and safeguarded sacred texts as a core part of their religious life. When Rome moved in, they concealed their library in that remote cluster of caves. One library, straightforward and tidy. The machine tore that story apart. The scrolls were not the product of a single community. They were written by dozens of different scribes, possibly hundreds, working across a span of at least 200 years. The handwriting analysis identified distinct hands spread throughout the entire collection. Some scribes appeared across multiple scrolls, suggesting long and active careers. Others appeared just once and never again. That represents far more variety than any single isolated sect could possibly account for. 200 years. Sit with that number for a moment. That is not one community copying its books within a single lifetime. That is people who were born, grew old, and died, passing the work on to the next generation, who had not yet drawn their first breath when the earliest of these scrolls were written. Entire generations of hands. The machine could see them all laid out at once, like fingerprints from a scene that stretched across 2 full centuries. And then there is the language problem. The scrolls contain Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Paleo-Hebrew, an archaic script that had already fallen out of everyday use long before these texts were even written. Why would one small, isolated community preserve scripture across 4 entirely separate writing systems? The machine pointed toward an answer that reshapes everything. The scrolls may not be the library of a single community at all. They may be something far more deliberate, a rescue operation. As Rome pressed harder on Judea, as the temple fell in 70 CE, as Jewish communities were torn apart and massacred throughout the region, sacred writings from across the whole area were gathered up and concealed in desert caves. Not the collection of a single sect. The emergency archive of an entire civilization, the final surviving pieces of a rich and varied Jewish literary world, carried into those caves by people who understood their world was collapsing and were desperate for something to outlast them. The Greek texts may have come from Hellenized Jewish communities in the coastal cities, the Hebrew from traditional communities living near Jerusalem. The Aramaic from rural populations who spoke the common everyday tongue of the land. Different communities, different caves, all reaching for the same darkness at the same hopeless moment. Do you see how much bigger that makes this? The old picture was almost reassuring. One quiet community copying its own texts and tucking them safely away when trouble arrived. But what the machine is describing is something else altogether. The emergency rescue of an entire civilization that understood it was being wiped out. Not a single library, the scattered memory of a whole world, hidden in the rock by dozens of different hands that never knew each other and were never meant to end up together in the same cave. Which means every fragment represents a choice made under pressure. Someone stood before their holy writings, knowing the soldiers were on their way, knowing they could not carry everything, and chose what to save and what to leave behind. And once the machine grasped that, it noticed something even more striking than what was actually in the caves. It noticed what was not there, the book that is absent. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain fragments from nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible. Nearly. The book of Esther is entirely missing. Not a single fragment of Esther has ever been identified among the 25,000 pieces that were recovered. And the book of Chronicles is almost absent as well, surviving only in the tiniest, most uncertain scraps. Why? This is what makes the absence genuinely puzzling. Esther is not a minor book. It tells the story of how Purim began, one of the most widely celebrated Jewish holidays. It recounts a tale of Jewish survival under a hostile empire, a theme that should have struck a deep chord, with communities being hunted into desert caves. Of every possible book to be missing, this is the one that should have spoken most directly to these people. And yet it simply is not there. The standard explanation is that the Qumran community rejected Esther on theological grounds, possibly because the book never once names God explicitly, but the machine's reading of the full body of texts points towards something more human. If the scrolls represent a rescue operation rather than a deliberately shaped canon, then the absence is not a theological statement. It is a casualty. Someone could not reach it in time. Someone could not carry it. It was left sitting on the shelf when the moment came down to a single armful of parchment and a long, terrified climb into a hidden cave. For generations, we have read that gap as a deliberate judgment, as though some council had gathered and formally struck Esther from the record. But if these are the books people grabbed while fleeing for their lives, then the missing book may simply be the one that someone could not get to. A book lost, not because anyone condemned it, but because hands can only hold so much when soldiers are closing in. What they managed to save tells us what mattered most to them. What they had to leave behind tells us what that moment took from them. The text, beneath the text. When the machine turned its attention to the books that did survive, it found they did not always say what they were expected to say. Back to the Greek fragments from the Cave of Horror. The machine ran these texts against the standard Septuagint, that ancient Greek rendering of the Hebrew Bible produced in Alexandria somewhere around the 3rd century before the Common Era, which went on to become the dominant Greek scripture throughout the Mediterranean world, and was later embraced by early Christians as their Old Testament. These fragments were expected to line up with that version. They did not, at least not fully. Word selections diverged. Phrases appeared in different arrangements. Certain passages seemed to have been translated on their own terms rather than drawn from the established text. At the very time these documents were being transcribed and concealed, no single fixed version of Greek scripture existed. Multiple competing editions were in circulation, each one regarded as authoritative by whatever community relied on it. That diversity was not something that crept in later as a form of corruption. The diversity was the original state of things, and the same held true among the Hebrew texts. Fragments showed clear divergences from the Masoretic tradition. The standardized Hebrew Bible that would not reach its final form until centuries after these scrolls had already been sealed away inside their jars. The Masoretic text sits at the foundation of every modern Jewish Bible and the majority of Christian Old Testaments. The scrolls came before it, and the scrolls tell a different story, different verses, different points of emphasis, passages that surface in the scrolls and never find their way into the later standardized edition. The Bible was not delivered as a finished, sealed document. It took shape across centuries, edited, contested, revised. The version that exists today is the outcome of decisions made by later communities about which texts to include, which readings to trust, and which versions to permanently fix as correct. The scrolls do not reveal this in order to shake anyone's faith. They reveal it because that is what is written on the parchment. They captured the moment just before those decisions were made permanent, a tradition that was still breathing, still disputed, still being interpreted in competing ways by different communities, before standardization quietly smoothed over all the differences. The machine found the fingerprints of that entire process scattered across the collection, scribal corrections where later hands had adjusted passages to match whichever version they preferred, erasures where text had been scraped away and replaced with something else, notes in the margins where scribes recorded alternate readings, fully conscious that other versions were out there and unsure which one was correct. These are the marks of a living tradition, still being shaped and argued over right up until the Romans arrived and destroyed the communities that had been preserving it. Standardization followed. One version rose to authority. The variants were left behind. The diversity dissolved from memory until almost nobody recalled it had ever been there. And then came what the machine found beneath the visible surface. Palimpsest detection uncovered writing that had been scraped away and written over. Earlier versions that scribes had removed in order to reuse costly parchment, leaving only faint impressions buried beneath the writing visible to the eye. Some of those impressions were alternate readings of already familiar texts. Some were fragments of writings that surface nowhere else in the entire Dead Sea Scrolls collection, and some were passages the machine could not match to any known ancient document whatsoever. That final group is the one worth holding on to. Those unmatched, erased passages may represent texts that existed nowhere else in the world. Writings someone scraped away because a later scribe judged something else to be more deserving of the parchment. Those documents are gone from us. They will never be recovered. All that remains is their ghost, the faint impression pressed into the leather by a pen that set them down before another pen wiped them out. Somewhere beneath the words we are able to read lie the words someone decided we should not. And for the first time, a machine has caught the very edge of them. What was actually uncovered here, the scrolls are not a single message. They are layers upon layers of messages, voices layered across centuries, sometimes in agreement, sometimes in conflict, sometimes wiping out what an earlier hand had written. The fragments from the Cave of Horror, transcribed by people who had no guarantee they would survive the night, concealed by people who could only hope a future soul might one day stumble upon them, belonged to that chorus. They sat in darkness for nearly 2,000 years, and a machine finally brought them to light. Here is what the AI genuinely uncovered within the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not a hidden conspiracy, a story. The story of how Scripture was actually built, how faith was debated, reproduced with alterations, revised under duress, and shaped by human hands long before it ever solidified into the texts the world now holds sacred. The machine read what no human eye was ever able to see. It discovered patterns that scholars had overlooked for 75 years. It laid bare a diversity that centuries of standardization had worked hard to flatten. It captured both fear and courage in the very strokes of each letter, and it made one thing unmistakably clear. The Bible people hold today is not the same Bible that existed 2,000 years ago. This does not shatter Scripture. It reveals it for what it has always been. A human endeavor to protect something sacred and carry it forward through generations, against fire, against empire, against the relentless weight of time. The people who concealed those scrolls inside the Cave of Horror understood they were not going to survive. They copied the texts regardless. They sealed them inside jars regardless. They held on to the hope that one day somehow somebody would find them and grasp what they meant. That hope was eventually answered. First by a shepherd running after a wandering goat, then by scholars who spent 75 years reassembling torn fragments with their own hands, and finally by a machine capable of reading what no human eye ever could. History has never been straightforward. Faith has never been straightforward. The scrolls are the evidence, and the machine has not stopped reading. So here's the question I keep turning over in my mind, and I want your answer waiting in the comments. If these communities made a deliberate choice about which texts were worth dying to protect, what does the book they were forced to leave behind tell us about what they were truly terrified of losing? Was the machine uncovering history or quietly reshaping it? Let me know below. And if this is the kind of buried story that grips you, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because there is still so much more sitting in the dark, waiting to be found.